Worrisome.
Yeah, and how are you finding the kind of lecturing, and how's that?
It's good. It's good, actually. I'm kind of basically gonna start going in next week, but it won't be for lectures, just because I work better in office settings outside the house. So
yeah,
but yeah, it's been long. It's been long.
Yeah, it's
looking forward to it ending, to be honest.
Well, we're so close, isn't it? We're so close. What we'll do, thank you for all those who've joined, all the participants who've joined. We're just going to leave it another couple of minutes for other people to log in and sign in, and the complexities around Zoom and what have you. So we're just going to, me and Ashok are going to have a little chat beforehand, and then we'll kick off more formally. I don't know, where were we?
Oh, we were talking about the tribulations of not only lockdown, but I think that, like, for me, it's also the question of like what people are dealing with at the end. Like now I see people are kind of panicking because there's so much buildup to how after lockdown, like the expectations of, because there was something liberating about like not being socially expected to do anything.
Yep.
Like people, like the loss of FOMO meant people felt like a bit liberated from having to do anything.
Yeah.
So then you start contesting how much of it is like self-determination, how much of it is like social convention. I can't go on Friday without going out because that would be crazy, right? But then you start not having to go out, and you're like, wait, actually, this isn't that bad.
Yeah. I completely can concur with that. And also then being cautious around going out into large groups. I think there's lots of people, feeling that's a kind of a step too far. Even friends of mine who've had both vaccines, certainly some of the kind of elder generations are going to be cautious for a while, and understandably.
Yeah. I mean, saying that, my dad didn't even have the vaccine and he was being totally reckless. So I mean, old people come in different sizes and shapes, My dad's like, I'm ready to go. I'm like, no, chill, Dad.
Okay, well, I think that's a good segue. I think it's a good time to start. So, everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining our ERC webinar. And as ever, kind of a couple of parish announcements before Ashok kicks in, which I'm really excited about. He's giving us a little talk about his book. The talk is going to be 30 minutes, then we'll dip into kind of Q&A. There will be a kind of a group session that hopefully Amy can let you in afterwards, so you can have a chat amongst yourselves kind of after the event. And we'll try and keep the talk and the Q&A really tight for time, and then we'll sign off, and then hopefully let you guys chat in the kind of in the chat room, as it were. So Ashok, Dr. Ashok, should we say? We are delighted to have you. Thank you for joining us and giving us a kind of insight into the book that you've just kind of pushed out on Monopsony Capitalism. Hopefully I pronounced that right, and I want to come to hopefully you're going to tell us whether that's a word that you've come up with or it's a word from somewhere else. But and the power and production in the twilight zone of the Sweatshop Age. I think you couldn't be better placed to say that's, given your background. Ashok is a political and economic lecturer at Birkbeck. You've got a PhD in economic geography from Oxford. I think without too much ado, I really should hand over to you to not only kind of introduce yourself, but then to get us engaged in this exciting topic. So over to you.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Amy, for inviting me to this discussion about, it's about this book that Will just introduced. Usually authors will have it sitting somewhere, but I find that a bit weird. But yeah, it's called Monopsony Capitalism, Power and Production in the Twilight of the Sweatshop Age. It's just come out maybe like 4 or 5 months ago. But it took about 7-8 years to work on. And the book sort of is trying to explain, and it's based on research in a number of different places, including sort of in-depth research in Honduras, China, India, a little bit in Vietnam, but also sort of archival research and secondary research in like Honduras, Cambodia, but archival research from the US and the development of certain sectors that are sweatshop sectors. So the basic kind of premise and the idea of the book is to try and explain the durability of the sweatshop, why it's continued to exist and why is it continued to expand, and while other parts of the sector and other parts of society seem to be developing quite quickly, certain sectors seem to be degenerating, and those sectors are very labor intensive and very gendered. And why is it that that's continued and has deepened? The violence of sweatshops have continued and deepened. And also trying to explain at a theoretical level what is a kind of underlying logic of capitalism, but also of competition, and also labor's bargaining power. So we'll get into all of that. But fundamental argument is, why do we have this durability of the sweatshop, and is there a way out, and what is the way out? And so it kind of the term monopsony, I didn't come up with it. It means where you have many sellers and few buyers. So it's a buyer's market. So typically, if you have like in labor markets, if you have an employer that is there's a universe. Let's say there's a small town, and there's one employer, and that employer is seeking one person to do a job, and that's the only job in town, and there's hundreds of people trying to get that job, trying to sell their labor power to be remunerated for their labor power. What that means is there's a high degree of monopsony power. So that means that the employer, the buyer of that labor power, has a lot of power, right? So that's what monopsony means. I didn't go out with it, but basically what I argue is that the entire supply chain and the entire these sweatshop sectors are shaped and circumscribed around this concept of monopsony, right? So to begin with, I guess I'll say, the question of what is the sweatshop, and why does it remain durable? For simplicity, I would say that the sweatshop is a workplace with very low bargaining power, typically in manufacturing, typically with a high ratio of labor to capital in terms of fixed capital investment. But really, without getting into the nitty-gritty of the exact definition, you kind of know it when you see it, right? And these have primarily been in the export-oriented sectors. It's primarily been in sort of garments, footwear, certain kind of toys, certain kind of furniture. And those have become kind of the sweatshop sectors. So they're low value, low technology, vertically disintegrated, which means, there's a separation in the various phases of the production process. So, if you walk into, say, a shop and buy a pair of Nikes, or Nikes as they call it in this country, they, typically none of the production process will be owned by Nike, right? All of it will be outsourced, from, the cotton fields to the textiles, to the actually ready-made garment factories, typically then logistics and warehousing and transport, and even the retail lots of times, unless it's like a Nike town or something. So basically the entire production process will have been outsourced to thousands of potential suppliers. And so what that does is, you have Nike and Adidas who have 60% of the casual and sports shoe market and their subsidiaries. So what that means is there's a few buyers, and then tens of thousands of potential suppliers fighting for the business from say Adidas or Nike. So what that does is it gives an uneven level of power, asymmetrical relationship of power to companies like Adidas and Nike. So people, typically when I explain what monopsony is, not to get into this pedantic, but I have some props that I found literally around my table, like these mugs. So typically when people say monopsony, they're like, I know what monopoly is, but I don't know what monopsony is. So monopoly is where you have three different, let's say there's three different mugs, and these are the entire universe are owned by of mug firms are owned in three separate parts by these three different companies. That means that, they have 30%, 33%, 33%, 33% degree of monopoly power, right? That means it's a horizontal relationship. These are horizontal relationships. Now, if this company takes over this company, acquires this company, that means this company now has a twice as high degree of monopoly power. Whereas monopsony is the vertical relationship. So it's if this company is needing to purchase a certain amount of ceramic, or purchase a set amount of other products, that's a vertical relationship. So monopsony is best seen as a vertical relation, monopoly a horizontal relation. Okay, now I'll stop with talking about that. And so I think that, if you look at these sectors, historically, the vertical disintegration in these sectors, which means they've always been vertically outsourced. They've always been outsourced. It's never that, companies like Adidas or Nike, even 100 years ago, owned the production process. What that meant was that they would constantly seek cheaper producers and cheaper producers. And if you study the history of how, factories, if you look at like auto factories or aeronautic factories or factories that produced anything, they were all sweatshops at one point, right? The way that changed was two factors. It was the material conditions, so the composition changes. So you have a firm that earns more money. So then workers go on strike, or workers take action at the workplace and withdraw their labor power, do any number of things. And they're able to bargain at that point. But in these sectors, in garments and footwear and so on and so forth, they have never really been able to bargain, because these suppliers have always made just enough to survive, right? So the minute that a certain amount of workers at a certain firm are bargaining at that firm, then the price of that product goes slightly nominally higher. Nike, Adidas, or H&M or whoever stops outsourcing them. So the book starts in Rana Plaza in Dhaka in 2013, where 1,129 mostly women were crushed to death in a factory collapse that happened. And that the factory that was producing that owned Rana Plaza, or produced products at Rana Plaza, produced for hundreds of brands. We don't even know all the brands they produced over. We know from like Primark to Prada that were being produced there. And so then the question became, why is it that you had this constant downward pressure? And so this is it's important to understand that, the products the product that's being produced is also informing the production process, which also informs the ability for workers to make demands at the workplace. So let's look at different sectors, right? If you look at, for example, an auto sector, people say, oh, auto sectors are more skilled. There's no such thing as, there is such thing as skill, but it's socially constructed. Like if you ask someone, is it easier in a highly automated auto factory to potentially be just pressing a button? That would be considered very skilled. Whereas if you're producing a shirt or a blouse from scratch using a sewing machine, which hasn't really been updated for about 150 years, for some reason, that's considered unskilled. Skill is largely a social construction, right? And there's a lot of literature on this, but what is the primary reason why an auto factory worker gets paid more, by multiples of 4 or 5, depending on the situation, depending on the location? An aeronautics worker gets paid even more, is this thing called disruptive power. So if you're let's say you're a capitalist in Cambodia or India, and you want to start a aeronautics plant, it'll cost you £1 billion. An export-oriented aeronautics plant, you want to produce planes, it'll cost you £1 billion of investment, potentially. You want to start an auto factory that's export-oriented, it might cost you 100 million. You want to start a garment factory that's export-oriented, that has 3,000 workers, it might cost you 1 to 2 million. So basically what that means is, if you're Adidas or Nike or whoever, and or not even Adidas, Nike, that's kind of changed now, but if you're like H&M or any of these big brands, you can travel the world, and there's potentially thousands, tens of thousands of fledgling capitalists who are trying to get the business of these large firms. So I have a second prop here. So imagine that these are suppliers, right? Wait, where is this? Okay. So this is a supplier. This little kernel is a supplier, right? This is the way that a supply chain in the garment and footwear sector. The reason why it's like a sweatshop is, down here is Nike. Here are the suppliers. It's like a bottleneck. These places are constantly competing to produce a shirt or a shoe or a toy or whatever for lower and lower prices, which means that they're constant, because there's never been enough reserves in these sectors to invest in labor-saving technology. It meant that the number one, the single most important variable in the production process is labor. So what that does is it puts constant downward pressure on labor. And so that's why you've seen over the last 30 years, innumerable state, independent NGO initiatives, WTO initiatives. That problem's notwithstanding, but also ILO initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives, none of them have had any impact on really, or a negligible impact on the conditions of workers in these sectors. Because there's a underlying logic of competition. That means that you will always have, it'll always be worth more to a company like H&M or Nike or Adidas. It'll be worth more to them than the amount of money they'll save from putting workers in poverty wages and risking their lives than any of the liability that comes from another Rana Plaza. You know, prior to Rana Plaza, there was a smart fire, 250 people died. I mean, the year before that, there was another fire in Pakistan where hundreds of people were asphyxiated to death. It had no effect on the bottom line of these companies, right? So it's there's that book by Ralph Nader, The Unsafe at Any Speed. I don't know what that noise is, but basically it means that, like, at the end of the day, the purpose of these companies is to maximize profits. And so there's a calculation that's made that says, well, we'll take on the liability of hundreds, potentially 1,000 more workers being crushed to death, because at the end of the day, it's not going to cost us that much. And changing the conditions of these workers, increasing their wages by a nominal amount, is more expensive to us than the possibility of the liabilities that are associated with their death or their illness. So the argument of the book, and this again traces 100 years of changes in the composition of capitalism, is that what you have is, just like monopsony. Let's imagine, right? I don't know how many people are on this thing, but let's imagine, okay, there's like 45 people here. Let's imagine Will is an employer, and he has a job that he can give us, like the example I gave earlier. And there's 45 of us seeking the job from Will. What that means is Will has a high degree of monopsony power, right? Because he can make us he pits us against each other in order to fight for that job. We're the suppliers in this case, and Will is let's say Adidas or Nike. Like, over time, what happens is that Will is constantly putting downward pressure. He wants this shirt, or he wants that job to be done for less and less. And there's always, the higher the degree of monopsony power, the cheaper you can get it, because the proportion of people who are willing to do it for less is greater, right? That's what you have when you have tens of thousands of potential suppliers around the world. What that does over time is that it whittles, just like this, as it gets higher and higher, fewer and fewer kernels, suppliers, are able to produce. As fewer and fewer suppliers are able to produce, the degree of monopsony power goes down as well. As the degree of monopsony power goes down, the share of value that's captured across the supply chain between the buyers, Adidas, Nike, H&M, and the suppliers also changes. So what you see really and I'm basically tracing it for the last 15 years, since the end of this thing called the multi-fiber agreement, which basically liberalized garment and footwear production across the world. What you see is that in short order, from 2005 to 2008, you have a high concentration of production in a handful of countries, namely China, which was producing a majority of garments in the world for export-oriented production between 2006 and 2009. That starts to change a little bit, but from being in the sort of far-flung corners of the globe from the 1970s, 80s, and into the 2000s, to then being concentrated into a handful of labor-rich countries. I mean, India, Turkey, Cambodia, Vietnam, China, even Honduras is one example of this. What that does is that, and this is the sort of second thesis of the book, is that prior to this period, sorry, I'm sort of running all over the place, but I'm trying to, basically what you had is in the 1920s, you had a similar problem in the garment sector, right? In Manhattan's Lower East Side, there's the garment sector, garment district, in which it was primarily sort of immigrant Jewish women that were working from Eastern Europe, who were working there and being exploited, and you had high levels of exploitation. You had this thing called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It was a very famous factory fire that happened in the first 2 decades in the US, where you had 114 women asphyxiate and die, and there was a huge outcry. And the International Lady Garment Workers Union organized the workers to put pressure at the point of production, so the factory owners, and the point of consumption. And they forced those two agents, so the buyers and the suppliers, to create a deal, so that they couldn't just cut and run and go to the next supplier. what that did, and because you had regulations around the state, and you had not that many capitalists in other places that could create factories, what that did was a form of regulatory spatial inflexibility. It meant that these companies couldn't really go to anyone else. And what that did was increase the bargaining power of those workers. So much so that you had, high union density. And by the late 40s, garment workers, women in the garment sector were making as much as auto workers, which is unprecedented, unheard of before and really after that. There was a 10-year period in which that happened. So you had the same, but that was a kind of regulatory form of spatial inflexibility. And what that did was it allowed the workers to make those demands and end the sweatshop for a very brief period of time. Then you had the crisis within capitalism in the late 60s, crisis of profitability in the 1970s. And all of a sudden, these firms are contracting out to the maquilas in the border of the US-Mexico border. You have forms of trade agreements that moves to Central America, then China, then Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. What that does is it all of a sudden, by the 1970s and 80s, you had this expansive monopsonistic relationship. So basically, factory owners and Nike, Adidas, I keep using Nike as an example, but others could, the example, Nike and many others like them, buyers could choose from any number of suppliers, right? So the degree of monopsony power goes very high. But because of the underlying logics of capitalism, and competition that I outline here, basically over time, those Nike, Adidas, H&M are making greater demands for a shirt, a shoe, or whatever. They're asking that more be produced for less of a price. That's what happens with the logic of competition. And as that happens, fewer and fewer suppliers are able to compete. Others go into the red, others absorb their market share. And as that happens, that composition changes. So then you move from a high degree of monopsony power to a kind of market spatial inflexibility. That market spatial inflexibility means that it's now, and so it now costs, Nike, Adidas, H&M, all these companies, when they're producing from certain suppliers, they don't have as many places to replace them, because this logic has meant that you've had a certain kind of monopolization at the point of production. So some of the cases I looked at were in 2014. You had a kind of shoe manufacturer. The parent company is called Po Yuan, but the actual manufacturer in China, it's a Taiwanese company, is called Hue Yen, and they. The workers there went on strike in 2014. It was 50,000 workers over social insurance. It was the largest private sector strike in the history of China. And why strikes are important, and I look at a number of strikes, is because not only because they're interesting kind of case studies, but also if you look at, there's this book by George Lukács where he says, actually, you can analyze capitalism in its totality at moments of rupture. So what the strike showed us was that Nike and Adidas and all these big companies, and this is the largest, producer, largest contractor, exclusive contractor for Nike and Adidas and all these other suppliers in the world. And what you found is that Nike, all these different companies couldn't find a place to replace. They found short-term replacements, but they came immediately back to Hue Yen once the strike was over. And the company, Hue Yen, was able to both absorb 2 weeks of strike action, but also paid out about $32 million worth of compensation in various forms without capitulating to the demand of the workers. And then you had a similar strike at a similar facility in a neighboring province. Then you had the largest strike in Vietnamese history at a similar facility around the same demands, and the workers were able to make gains there as well. So what that shows us is that historically, if there was a strike in any of these firms, big companies would simply cut and run and find someone else. But right now, Nike and Adidas need Hue Yen almost as much as Hue Yen needs Nike and Adidas, right? So what that does is it creates a kind of relational fixity that makes it so that workers in those places have greater disruptive power. Another case I look at in depth, excuse me, is in India. So this is the largest, by the way, Hue Yen is the largest shoe manufacturer in the world. There's 40 people on this call. One in 4 shoes would be produced at a Hue Yen facility and whereas 20 years ago it might cost you $1 million. That Cambodian or Indian capitalist, it might cost them $1.5 million to start a firm, a shoe manufacturing firm. Now, because they're competing with firms like Huyen, which are like entire cities of production facilities, and they're now investing in labor-saving technology, it might cost 10 million. What that does is it increases the barrier to entry, which reduces the monopsonistic relationship, right? Another case I look at is Arvind. Arvind is the third largest denim producer in the world. Exclusive producer. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, we've got a couple minutes and then we're going to move.
Okay, yeah, I'll be quick. They produce for PVH, Philip Van Housen, the largest shirt manufacturer in the world, for like Calvin Klein, so on and so forth. And they, as well, a kind of 5-year-long workplace action there meant that they could, again, what you saw was, even though it may have cost these companies money, it was disruptive, it increased their liability, so on and so forth, increased their risk, they didn't replace Arvind. And the fact that they couldn't replace them meant that you had greater disruptive power, which means that actually in these sectors, so certain parts of these sectors, like denim, which is more valorizable, which is open to being invested in technologically, or shoes, or because I'll just say this really quickly. The reason why these sectors are so difficult to standardize and invest in labor-saving technology is because they're constantly changing, because of seasonality, ephemeral fashion trends. I produce a car, I could produce the same car for the next 5 to 10 years. That means you can standardize that. If I'm producing this shirt isn't the same as that shirt, that's very hard to standardize. So they've never been able to escape the orbit of low profits and outsourced relationship. Whereas that is changing in certain parts of it. And the last sort of empirical chapter I look at is men's undergarments, which is entirely vertically integrated. You have 3 big ones, Fruit of the Loom, Hanes, Gildan, and those are largely vertically integrated. Why? Because it's cheaper for those people to invest directly in production. And that's why you've had greater bargaining in those sectors. And basically you've seen 17%, 20% wage increases in those parts of the sector than any other parts of the sector. So sorry, it's a bit convoluted, but long story short, the sector is changing. These sectors, but it's not going to happen through the benevolence of the state. It doesn't happen through the benevolence of consumers or NGOs or corporation codes of conduct, which aren't really worth the paper they're printed on. They happen because of 2 factors: the material conditions, so the general composition of capitalism and how that changes. Conversely to what like neoclassical economists will say, workers don't get what they deserve. Also, workers just can't demand whatever they want. Workers get what they demand from what's available. So what material conditions means is that more is available, but it also requires that workers actually organize and take action at the workplace in order to demand greater benefits, because it's not going to happen automatically. So that's why we're in the Twilight of Sweatshop Age.
That's why in the Twilight of Sweatshop. That was epic. I mean, there's just so much there that we could dive in. I mean, I find it fascinating. It kind of touches on Porter's 5 forces, right? Where you've got this kind of complex relationship with buyer and seller, right? And that's what it sounds like you're saying is as the I suppose the supplier power builds, that's when the levels of the workforce can then start demanding, greater security or social security, as you're saying, or better working conditions. But before, I mean, there's a ton of questions that come in, which is always great. I mean, call centers today, is that the kind of 21st century sweatshops? Are you talking like?
Well, I think that there's lots of places in which people are heavily exploited. I think that call centers are one of those places. I think the thing about, it's a little bit different because it's one of those, these distinctions are without a difference oftentimes, because you're like, there's service sectors that are not necessarily producing commodities in the same kind of way. And so they're a different animal, but I mean,
like Amazon, for example, that's another one. Kind of Amazon, does that have power over its delivery drivers in that same kind of context where there's a labor?
So if you look at what Amazon's doing, Amazon is basically at first you don't have that much bargaining power because you're a warehouse in the middle of nowhere. But as Amazon invests greater and greater and greater amounts, because it's cheaper for Amazon to consolidate in one place and invest in labor-saving technology and all that stuff, what that does is it makes it very difficult for them to replace those workplaces. So over time, it means that those places become more vulnerable to disruption, which increases the bargaining power of those workers.
Yeah. Okay. That kind of that makes sense. How much? What is our role as kind of Western customers to apply pressure on corporate practices? And how so what is the role? But also, does it have an impact? Or from your research and all the kind of evidence-based stuff that you've been looking at, does it make a difference?
Well, look, I think that there's really well-intentioned people in the West, and they see these things and they're genuinely horrified. I remember when Rana Plaza happened, a bunch of people stood in front of Primark and were like, Primark bad. And I'm like, look, that's just like, not to be offended, but like that's middle class people in the West blaming working class people in the West for things that are affecting working class people in the global South. Fact is, it's all made in sweatshops, other than like maybe some haute couture. Basically, all of it's made in the most horrendous conditions, all high street places. But I would say that, so it comes from a good place, but it's just really the only way historically that we know the best and most effective way that people can use. And I use the ILGWU example, where they put pressure at retail and at production. But retail production and consumption pressure is a secondary pressure point. So, excuse me, God, I don't have COVID, but I basically, it's in the last empirical, not that it would affect you, but I was
going to say, yeah. Should I get a mask on?
Cover your mask. Yeah, put on your mask. Basically, the last empirical chapter is about Fruit of the Loom. The entire supply chain in Honduras is, it's the largest private sector employer in Honduras, second largest employer after the state. And Fruit of the Loom, which is the undergarments, they have 9 factories. It's their entire supply chain basically is in Honduras. It's vertically integrated. In 2007, 2008, workers there organized a union. They were, fired. The factories closed down. It's called Jersey City, Honduras. It's an entire case in the book. Basically, what you saw was that a number of allies and activists and trade unions in the West, in America, Canada, and Britain, organized a boycott. And within 6 months, it wasn't individual boycotts, it was institutional boycotts. So universities cut contracts, Dick's Sporting Goods, which is like the equivalent of, some sporting goods company here, was willing to cut their contract. The NBA was discussing cutting their contract. So within 6 months, you had, over 100 universities cutting their contract, ending their relationship, cost them materially over $50 million. And what that did was bring Fruit of the Loom, which is a subsidiary of, Russell Athletic, which is subsidiary of Fruit of the Loom, which is a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway, coming to the table, kicking and screaming. These people aren't going to come willingly, right? They owned slaves 150 years ago, right? So it's like, they're not going to come there. They're going to come there, Marx famously in Capital, in Volume 1, Chapter 10, on the working day, famously says, and he's talking about the working day, the struggle for the working day. And he says, between two rights, force decides. What that means is saying this is the rights of workers and proclaiming that doesn't do anything. And the capitalists, the proprietors of capital saying this is our right, that doesn't do anything. What actually changes the conditions of the working class is force. You say, look, do this or it's gonna cost you money. Do this or we're gonna go on strike. That's the only thing that's really made a difference in these sectors.
So as you said, as those sweatshops amalgamate, then they have more supplier power.
They have more bargaining power.
They have
more disruptive power, but they have to they can't just say, oh, this is an automatic relationship. They have to assert that.
Yeah. Okay. But so sweatshops and the working conditions terrible. Right? And I just what's the transition from as labor. So developed countries, we have our own issues, but then developing countries, quite often you've got that labor migration from farms and terrible working conditions in paddy fields in China to actually then moving to a factory. And you speak to some of those I'd be really interested to get your view on this. You speak to some of those labor workers and they're like, I got a roof over my head, I'm not up to my waist in mud, and I'm getting paid more. And even if it's kind of going from 20 cents to $1, I'm still getting paid 50% more than I was working in a paddy field. What is it? Just a natural progression of society?
Okay, well, this is a very deep question, Will.
Yeah,
so
okay,
I mean, there's a bevy of analysis of this. Adam Smith talks about this in his Primitive Accumulation chapter in Wealth of Nations. Marx, obviously, chapter 26, the so-called primitive accumulation. It's all about, if you look at England, when you had the Enclosure Acts, what were the Enclosure Acts? The Enclosure Acts were introduced to privatize public goods in order to force the peasantry. This is the first place that became sort of industrial capitalism in the world. You force peasants into cities. They didn't go willingly. In China, you had a much more authoritarian state. So it's done hegemonically in Britain, historically in the 1700s. In China, it's done forcibly through an authoritarian state. So literally moving people million by million. In India, between 1989 and 2009, you had the largest shift from basically 89% to 70% from rural to urban, not through forcible relocation, but literally making people's lives unlivable in rural areas. I'm not romanticizing rural areas. Rural life is horrendous in loads of ways, but it's not like people were like, yay, city, sweatshops, slums, let me come willingly. You had forms of coercion. You had forms of like, quite literally forcing people into cities. I mean, E.P. Thompson writes about this great British historian, that they made it. It used to be the case prior to this in Britain. I'm going to go off on one really quickly, but basically prior to this, if you went on on a feudal lord's land and there was a deer there that you were hunting, you could kill it, you could take it, you could eat it, right? They passed a law that says if you even step on this land, you'll get killed. E.P. Thompson documents this in Whigs and Tories, that dozens of people were literally killed by the state for even stepping on a feudal lord's land. Why? Because you're trying to make the lives of peasants so untenable that they're forced to sell their labor power to a capitalist in a city.
So they're forced to move into the city.
Yeah, this is what primitive accumulation is. It doesn't just automatically happen that all of a sudden cities emerge and people are like, oh my God, prior to the 1500s, 99% of this country and the world produced just enough to subsist on.
Yeah.
Fast forward 200 years later, and all of a sudden they're selling their labor power to surpluses that are being produced in agriculture.
Does innovation have a part to play in that, a role to play in that, with the less need of labor power within the fields? And then,
of course, no. So basically, E.M. Wood wrote this great essay. She passed away a few years ago, but basically, that between 1500s and 1700, in England had the most productive agriculture in the history of the world. Why is that the necessary precondition to producing labor power? So workers that don't need to work in a field and can sell their labor power to a capitalist, and then take the ruminated, the currency they get and buy food with it. The necessary precondition to capitalism is the production of wage laborers or workers. The necessary precondition to producing wage laborers is the surplus production of food. And she documents this very clearly, that that's what happens in England. It's not the case that we didn't have the necessity no longer existed. Of course, the necessity didn't exist because all of a sudden you have the surplus of food. It's both that the necessity didn't exist because they're producing a surplus of food, and you have the coercive arm of the state pushing people into cities.
Pushing people into those. And I think China had exactly that as well, right? We need more.
Look at the Pearl River Delta region. Pearl River Delta region prior to 1978 was just paddy fields. Then all of a sudden, fast forward 20 years, and it's completely optimized for the conditions of capitalist accumulation. And it's like the majority of all the products in the world are being produced in this region because quite literally tens of millions of peasants are being pushed into these cities. And they have a system there called the Hukou system. I don't know if people know this. It's where you have a legal framework, which was introduced actually by Mao, but where they separate your material conditions from your social conditions. So if I'm a peasant in rural mainland China, and all of a sudden I'm forced into this, I have a migrant status. Migrant status means that I can't tap into any of the resources. And so all of a sudden you have these cities that don't need to pay elderly care, that don't need to pay for children's education, don't need to do any of the things that cost the state and capital money. And so Eli Friedman, other people have written about this, but basically that lays the foundation. So if you're a state, that's why capitalists love migrants so much. I mean, they don't love migrants. They actually don't like migrants, but they like the idea of migrants because you have this fully formed human who comes here and can be exploited. You don't have to worry about them as children. You don't have to, because that's unproductive labor. You don't have to worry about like their mother being unproductive when they're bearing them and rearing them and taking care of them, right? So all of a sudden you have this highly productive person. That's what happened in China. You have this highly productive system in which all of a sudden they're worked, exploited, squeezed the lifeblood out of, and then they're pushed back for these very impoverished rural areas to then care for into death. So that's what you call the care chain. Children and old people are all in these kind of impoverished areas, and these like basically glossy, built up areas in like Guangzhou and Shenzhen in the Pearl River Delta don't have to spend any money on actual social reproduction, on actual things that cost them money. They can just exploit people. And that was constructed. That's a form of primitive accumulation. To the question of what do you say, the peasant to the proletariat, or the peasant to this worker, that's a process that doesn't just happen automatically. It doesn't happen from the void. It's constructed. That's not conspiratorial. That's just saying it both is a process and it's also constructed.
Is it a necessary evolution of capitalism where then you have capital flowing into that country, then you have the workers being paid slightly more, then the workers, what's important behind that, which is labor will then eventually demand, once there's an aggregation, will eventually demand better working conditions. And therefore, once the supplier power basically is increased because suppliers are acquiring, so is it just a natural evolution?
This is literally the extent of kind of Leninist debates of the 20th century. Like so you have like Mao's Great Leap Forward. Why does he do the Great Leap Forward? Because he's like, we have to rush through this very Stalinist idea of what is a stagist idea of capitalist development. So when Marx, I mean, this is like, China is basing their ideas on a very vulgar idea of Marx. Obviously, the Soviet Union did as well. That you have to go through this phase of capitalism to get to socialism, right? That's their idea. I think that there's a lot of flaws with that, but basically it's this argument that you say, okay, we need to rush and produce and become a highly productivist society, creating that value so then we can distribute that value to everyone. I mean, of course, I think that, that's what I mean. Like, I actually think that there's a lot of truth to that. Unfortunately, you can't, if you were China in the there's a reason why, for example, England in theory could be a far more distributive and welfare-based society than, say, Burkina Faso, a country which was like exploited by colonialists versus the country that was the colonizer, like France or England, whoever, who extracted that wealth, can be far more distributive. And so that's just an example of where you can, Burkina Faso can't just say, okay, everyone's gonna be living large now, like they are in China, in France, because it's a far more underdeveloped country. So I think that there's a lot of truth to that,
So it's such a rich topic. It's kind of, the percentage of skilled labor, there's a bit of a change of skilled labor. Has that been disrupted by the pandemic? And kind of does that change has that changed globally? Have you seen any evidence of that?
Well, I think it's difficult because it's kind of a broad question of, has skilled labor changed because of I mean, I'm always very critical of the question of skill and unskill, because if you look at any sector, with very few exceptions.
Sorry, it's our perception of, not percentage.
Oh, our perception, yeah. I think that was the hope, right? Like what I remember, the idea around the idea of key workers, for example, is a kind of double-edged thing. The key worker thing was usually mobilized by many states in order to say this was your national duty, but so then people could continue to be working for low wages or whatever without demanding remuneration. So it's a form of like cultural hegemony. But then also it was about centering those workers. So it's like, I do think that people had maybe a newfound recognition of that. It was always in our society that the job creators, the wealth creators were the essential ones, and the people who were stocking grocery stores were the inessential ones. But what the pandemic showed us was that those so-called essential workers were locked away in some gated community, and it had a parasitic relationship to society, in the sense that quite literally these inessential workers would have to risk their lives to get them food. They weren't producing anything. They weren't actually doing anything for society meaningful. The actual people that were doing stuff for society were the workers that were always treated as the lowest rung in society. So I do think in a lot of places it did give that, but the only places where you saw wages increase for those workers were places like, certain sectors, like in California, where cashew workers went on strike, and various agriculture workers went on strike, or in Sierra Leone, where lots of nurses went on strike. And you didn't actually see wages increase anywhere, including this country, where they begrudgingly gave a 1% increase to nurses.
The NHS, exactly.
Where you don't see the wages increase anywhere. It was just this like totally abstracted recognition. The only places was when workers actually said, okay, you're going to recognize us? Well, now we're going to actually assert our centrality, our power, and be disruptive. And then all of a sudden,
and that's really where it makes an impact.
that's what happened.
Because one of the questions came in, examples in the healthcare supply chain where we see these factors, and it's synonymous across all sectors, right? If you're going to look at that, and it's only when workers then assert their power. What's the solution here? What should we do to encourage the reduction of sweatshops? And
so when
we're going to rattle through quite a few questions, but obviously we're kind of now getting short of time, and so it gets exciting.
Okay, yeah, just give me a few. I guess.
Yeah, so let's do that. Let's do that one.
I think if you look at this different cases in the book, for example, this is not me just plugging the book. It's a good reference point. Huyen happens in 2014. All of a sudden, in various different places, including in London, other places, people are like, "Oh wow, there's a strike happening. Let's put pressure on Adidas and various different shops that sell these goods." And that pressure is the way that you do that is a form of solidarity, right? The only way to confront ever around and demonstrate our support for workers is through solidarity. So if you look at the Fruit of the Loom case, the Russell Athletic case, the Honduran one, it was forms of solidarity that put pressure on institutions to say, you know what, we're gonna put pressure on these companies from this side while you put pressure on. It's like they're putting it down here, we're putting it up there, and we're squeezing capital in the middle, like
it's solidarity at both ends. Solidarity, but kind of boycotting at kind of both ends. Quite interesting. So when the Chinese company that went on strike, obviously the relationship between the customer and the company changed. But what about the factory and the workers? Did that change as well? Were there better working conditions?
Well, in the Huyen facility, there were a series of demands that were being made. I mean, it also speaks to the kind of aging population of the Chinese working class, but industrial working class. But their demands were on social insurance, that they weren't being the social insurance program that was introduced by the state and wasn't really fully being respected by Huyen, and there was a miscalculation. Anyways, a number of other demands that were being made were given out to workers. So I think upwards of $32 million worth of concessions were given out to workers. I think it was 33 million. And then the company were able to withstand $26 million of losses from the 2 weeks. That 32 million isn't nothing. They didn't win their demands, but they did win concessions. And you could say concessions, we can call them gains, but they won stuff, right?
Yeah.
The fact is that, in 2010, when Honda workers in China went on strike, the state introduces collective bargaining for the first time. And why does the state introduce collective bargaining? Because collective bargaining is a way of militating against militancy. It's an important thing. It's a class compromise, right? So that's the same reason why it was introduced in the West as well. It's like you win gains, but it's also about disciplining workers. In China, they had between 2009 and 2015, they were having 50,000 wildcat strikes per year. I mean, it was like more than all the strikes in the world combined in a tiny region, per region. I mean, not tiny, but a region that was, dwarfed by the rest of the world, obviously. But then if you look at other things people can do, I think if in terms of the factory owner, they were able to win those demands, but it's also that it's that happened in Shenzhen. No, that happened in Guangzhou, the first strike. The copycat strike of the same facility with the same demands, and they won basically all their demands in Shenzhen, happens within 6 months at the same facility, the same company. The same company, Huyen, the largest private sector employer in Vietnam, outside of Ho Chi Minh City, they go on strike and they win all of their demands from the same company. And they make the same. The thing is that people,
so it does
workers
work.
Also communicate. Workers also communicate. And if I'm working for some company, if I'm working for some warehouse and there's 1,000 different companies and 1,000 different warehouse companies, I won't necessarily feel like my struggle is the same as the struggle of a warehouse worker nearby.
Yeah, for sure.
But if it's the same company, I'm going to feel like, okay, I can make the same demands, So they did that.
Which is, and that's maybe the advantages of technology right today.
Totally. I mean, they were commuting through Chinese social networks like Weibo and all these other different things. And they were able to do that really efficaciously. Yeah.
Can the sweatshops of yesterday become the monopolies of today, or of tomorrow, as it were? And then can that also then, okay, well then where's the new base of the sweatshops of tomorrow? Is that kind of Africa? How does this move? Is it like
Yeah.
whack-a-mole?
Yeah, I mean, the best person that writes about this is David Harvey in Limits of Capital, but also like a number of people, the relationship of space and capital. Like, where is it possible for Jacques Rancière, the French philosopher, said that there's no replacement to the Chinese industrial working class. You do not have the same kinds of access to raw materials, compliant state, surpluses in labor, all of the things that China offers. You can get a little bit from mainland China. Vietnam is replacing. I mean, look, you've had 3 to 5% FDI reduction in the last 5-6 years. I mean, wages are increasing in China. You know, they've increased 20-fold since 25-fold.
Which is amazing.
14.5% in real terms from 2008 to 2015.
Yeah.
What that does is that's for a number of factors. It's because workers have gone on strike, but it's also about labor ratios. You know, the reserve army of labor, the monopsony relationship has also fallen, right? There's just not as many workers, and so they can make greater demand. So is there another place that factories or companies can go to produce their goods? Well, they're going to Vietnam.
Yeah.
They're going to mainland China. They're also going to parts of Africa. So Ethiopia is big, but Ethiopia is just not built up to the same level, right? And it doesn't have the same kind of compliant state. It'll probably get there. I mean, if anything, parts of Africa will be the next place.
The next phase.
But I think it's difficult for them to absorb the same kinds of like also the levels of consumption are going up, you know, across the world. So it's hard to know. It's hard to know.
It's okay. Should we be, I mean, so there's one side of labor and effectively the mistreating of your workforce, which is ultimately what is going on here. And then as those workforces build strength and power, united or by consolidating, then they can create greater demands. Should we be afraid of technology coming through? And, you know, we look at the world of kind of robotics, we look at the world of automation, we look at Amazon warehouses, 3 people in a 30,000 square foot kind of warehouse. Is that going to create problems for the global levels of workforces in terms of just not having a job? Should that something should be afraid of? I suppose that leads into kind of, I suppose, labor-saving innovations. What do you see on the horizon? Which is a labor-saving innovation, which for me is technology. But then is that a negative or a positive?
So I think that there are a lot of people out there who are writing really, I think, fiction about how this is going to change everything and things are happening dramatically. You go through various phases in which people talk about this. But anyone who's worked at an Amazon warehouse will attest the technology is half the time is breaking down. We're not at the crisis point where people are. I just don't think we are. I think it's something to be aware of, but I think as companies become more monopolistic as well, increasing their profits, increasing their value, they can invest in R&D, and things can happen in leaps and bounds very, very quickly. I think that, in this debate, the vast majority of technology is, technology is almost always for the purposes of labor saving, right? It's always, right? This isn't a Marxist argument. This is a Keynesian argument. This is a Smith argument. In the first 3 pages of Wealth of Nations, he's literally saying the innovations of capital are based on the innovations of labor. So that's, I think that we can't miss the point there. It's not like the vast majority of the world is going to benefit from this. It's also, we have to make a difference between the advanced capitalist world, where you're seeing technological advancements, and the vast majority of the world where, you're having the great doubling or tripling. Between 1972 and 1999, the industrial working class of the world doubled, right? This is the Friedman, not the Thomas Friedman, different Friedman argument. But, and so it's the vast majority of commodities that are produced in the world. People are like, look at how Amazon warehouses are being technologically advanced. I'm like, they're just a distributor. All of those goods are being produced somewhere by hands, So it's like, I really just think that what we need to do is not to oppose technology. We should exploit the fact that people, if an Amazon facility is investing more, like I'm articulating here, what it does is it increases their disruptive power. It is, like I gave the example of the Cambodian or Indian capitalists trying to invest in aeronautics. There is literally no aeronautics facilities there that aren't state-owned. But what it means is that worker at that aeronautics facility is all of a sudden being like, I can organize a handful of workers and shut this place down. It's like a port. If you look at a dock or a port, they're hugely technologically advanced now, but they have very large wage. They have very high wages. Why? Because they can shut down an entire port with a handful of workers. The problem is that you basically create a labor aristocracy that's not then distributed to the vast majority of the working class. It's like if you have these workers in a dock in the West Coast in the US, so the ILWU, which is the International Longshoremen Workers Union, which is a very powerful union, they shut it down. They increase their wages, very high wages. They're moving goods from China or wherever, Cambodia, where the workers, that doesn't distribute to the workers across the world. What it does is it creates a creamy layer of workers that are able to make enormous demands. I'm happy for them, but at the same time, that's not distributive. The way you get a distributive society, or the way you distribute that, is that you then make demands on the state. So I think and the demands in the state happen through the self-realization of people, workers and others organizing themselves. So one of the things that people have said, this is the welfare state of the 1920s and 30s and 40s. You had huge amounts of worker unrest. The state says, okay, wait. You also had the threat of, say, the Soviet Union and so on and forth. Like communism was a threat in the minds of in the advanced capitalist world. So all of a sudden they say, okay, here, we'll give you the crumbs. Will that satiate you? And it did satiate people for a while. But right now, I think that unless it's not an automatic relation. Unless people are self-organizing and making those demands, saying we actually want a share of the pie, and going even further, it's like we're not going to fight over the crumbs. We want to take over the kitchen. We want more of this. We produce value in society. Why are these people living in gated communities that we're delivering food to get to keep it all, right? And unless that demand is made on the state, it's not going to happen, because it's just not going to happen. It's not happening. Look at the U.S. The U.S. hasn't had, barely had a welfare state, and it's been degenerating since 1973. And that's because you've had a much more beaten back and retrenched working class.
And what about kind of for positive change? Could major nations, government levels encourage the rule of law and rights, allowing kind of workers to organize themselves kind of in problem countries? So could you have kind of geopolitical pressures, and then I suppose therefore preventing countries applying laws to not allow workers to kind of organize or go on strikes and what have you?
There's been a long history of this. So basically in 1995, when the WTO was created, 1997 it was officially created, there was a huge debate called the Social Clause Amendment. And the Social Clause Amendment was that in order to become a member of the WTO, and this was being pushed by primarily global North unions, but also lots of radical global South unions, that in order to become a member union, you have to sign on to basically the core convention of the ILO, which the International Labor Organization of the United Nations, which lots of it is not very controversial, but one of it's very controversial, which is freedom of association, by and large meant the right to democratic unions and collective bargaining. So that was pushed back, and it was not included in the WTO. But parts of social clauses were introduced in certain trade agreements, like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, part of the Maastricht Agreement. The point is that these are never really enforced. So Lance Capa at Columbia has done loads of research on this for NAFTA and CAFTA, hasn't been applied. Look at the Maastricht Agreement so people like Adrian Smith and Liam Campling at Queen Mary have done recent research in Moldova and other Eastern European countries where you do have an industrial working class, where they do try to apply some of the agreements of the EU. They just aren't applied, right? Like there are, sometimes you can apply some of the EU's agreements in Western European countries, but you can't really assert it in the same way in Eastern European countries because they're producing in those countries precisely because it's cheap.
It's interesting. Therefore, it comes back to how do you solve this? How do you solve this problem? And there's no question, it is a problem, because the working conditions of some of these sweatshops are horrendous, and it's about creating the power within those groups of workforces to then have that greater demand on the kind of on that effect.
I'll say one positive thing. I know that it sounds very negative, but actually the book is actually it's supposed to be a positive thing. It's that there was a lot of controversy in the 1980s and 90s where there were high-profile cases in which you had child labor. Right? You've all but abolished child labor without really laws being passed. I mean, of course, you have child labor laws, but the liability of child labor was so high. It's one of those cases where you're like, that companies, if companies could make a profit by having the infants work, they would do it. But the thing is that the point is that the liabilities were so high, and there were such high profile cases. So like Kathy Lee Gifford's clothing line, Sean Puffy Cohen's clothing line, like these high profile cases from the 90s and early 2000s meant that companies were like, okay, we don't care how hard you're working these people. We don't care if you are an intransigent employer. We just got to make sure they're 18 or older. So, I mean, that was enforced. And actually, so what that means is it's possible. It wasn't
necessarily forced legally. It was almost forced emotionally and morally.
Exactly. Well, not even morally, but in terms of like the liabilities, it's a huge risk for a company if they're found to have children working there.
And you know, I think there is a responsibility. One of the attendees there's a huge responsibility on us as consumers. We as consumers and making sure we're buying our product responsibly. You know, we all want to buy cheaper phones or cheaper laptops, but it's actually taking a step back and going, okay, well, where is this made, and where is there a probability that my shirt is made in a sweatshop? Yes, there is. Okay, well then my responsibility therefore is to go and buy a locally sourced locally sourced shirt from the UK, or if
I mean, I'm not saying there's no responsibility, but at the end of the day, companies like Apple, for example, who like are contracting with Foxconn, where you had huge amount, lots of suicides, it was a morbid reminder of their working conditions. If they gave, like 2%, 4% more of their enormous profits to the workers, the consumer doesn't have to suffer and the workers don't have to suffer. Yeah. Like there's this kind of weird guilt feeling where they're like, you should feel bad about, because no, it's these companies. They're the one responsible. We're not responsible, and the workers aren't responsible.
Yeah, there was balance, isn't it? Balance. Ashok, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. We've overrun by 2 minutes. Apologies for the for that. And obviously, we're going to Amy's going to transfer those of you into the kind of waiting room so that you can kind of talk amongst yourselves. I found that stimulating. Can you hold up your book again? Because I'd love to see that. Make sure for those who go out there and buy it. It's been
you can get it from it's with Cambridge University Press. You can get it from their website. Don't get it from Amazon, or get it from Amazon. It's cool.
Yeah, exactly. Get it from Amazon. Where's it made? Right? Where's it put together?
It was made in India, but
oh my God, here we go.
It was made by a union. I don't know.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for your time. I know you've got a bunch of stuff that you're doing this evening. We as the ERC are really privileged to have you, and we'll obviously send this out to our members and for the recording to be ever held. So thank you and have a great evening, and we'll catch you hopefully soon. Catch you soon. Thank you, Amy.
Let people know if you'd like to stay on. We're going to elevate everybody to become a panelist, and you can have continue the informal discussion amongst yourselves.